You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Welcome to The Open Door, a show based on the words in Revelation, "I have left an open door before you, which no one can close." This is WCAT Radio's longest-running show, which opened the door to the radio station in October 2016. It's currently offered by Jim Hanink, Mario Ramos Reyes and friends, and remains open to the love of God in its call to build a culture of life and a just social order through the panel's discussion of the Catholic social teaching principles of solidarity, subsidiarity, and economic democracy. The Open Door also explores nonviolence, distributism, and communitarianism. So join us at the Open Door, where you too can be part of the conversation.
Jim Hanink here with fellow panelists Mario Ramos Reyes and Valerie Niemeyer. And we welcome you to the Open Door. Today, we discuss a theology of disability and its philosophical commitments. How is it that we can best see and serve disabled persons? What lessons can they in turn teach us? Our welcome guest is Dr. Marc Tumeinski of Anna Maria College and Holy Apostles College and Seminary. His doctoral research brought together in ecumenical dialogue the writings of Joseph Ratzinger / Benedict XVI and John Howard Yoder. And who would ever say that there isn't a Catholic Mennonite Amish dialogue? Whoever says such a thing is wrong. But let's begin as we always do in prayer. Come, O Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful and enkindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you shall renew the face of the earth. O God, who has taught the hearts of the faithful by the light of the Holy Spirit, grant that by the gift of the same Spirit we may be always truly wise and ever rejoice in his consolation. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. Dr. Tumeinski, Marc, if we may, could you first please tell us a bit about Anna Maria College and its mission?
Absolutely, and thank you for this opportunity. So, Anna Maria is a small Catholic college in central Massachusetts, probably 1,000 undergraduates, maybe 300, 400 graduate students. It was started in 1946 by the Sisters of St. Anne, who themselves were founded in 1850 in Quebec by Blessed Marie-Anne Blondin, who was beatified in 2001. And really the mission of the college is to, or at least the education, is we have a lot of professional disciplines and we try to offer a liberal education to them as well. Probably not a classic liberal arts education, but we have a general education program that really focuses on many of the liberal arts disciplines. So, and in addition to that, they also take philosophy and theology. So I'm in the theology program, and so all the students take 2 theology courses, and then we have a small pastoral ministry program where we do the deacon formation for the Diocese of Worcester. And we also have many pastoral ministers who come and study there, DREs and others who are working in parishes. So, and it's a wonderful opportunity. And if you aren't aware of the Sisters of St. Anne and their charism or Blessed Marie-Anne Blondin, I would encourage you to check it out. Very inspiring charism and really is central to what we're trying to do. Particularly that focus, she had a real focus and the order has a focus on offering education to those who typically wouldn't have it available to them. And also think about ways to offer service in the spirit of Christianity as well. So it's a wonderful legacy that we're doing our best to carry forward.
All right. Thanks for getting us located. Mario?
Well, good morning. How did you come to your special focus on disabilities?
Yeah, great question. The one word answer is providence. It's providential. So I actually, as an undergrad, I'd studied computer science. And when I graduated, I went to a state university. I graduated and I don't know, I didn't really find a job actually. And so I took a part-time job at a human service organization and I was going to work on their computer systems. But what this organization did was they found jobs mostly for men, but for women as well, who had some kind of psychiatric disorder. And I was supposed to just have a part-time job there, working on their computer system, updating those. But something about what they were doing intrigued me, the mission that they had as an organization. And it was all quite new to me. I grew up in small town and really had never spent much time with anybody who was impaired in any way. And so this was eye-opening for me. And I asked my boss at the time, who had hired me, I was very interested in what they were doing. And could I stay on and be involved in that? And I give him a lot of credit. He said yes. And so that was really my start at getting to know people who had some kind of impairment. So I was actually working with a number of men who did have some kind of psychiatric or mental disorders, trying to find work for them and getting to know them. Frankly, what really struck me was the poverty that they faced was probably the biggest barrier that they had, much more so than their psychiatric disorder, just their growing up in poverty, not a lot of opportunity for education, for meeting people, for developing relationships and skills. And so it was a real eye-opener for me and was a way for me also, frankly, probably to really get more immersed into my own faith. I mean, I grew up Catholic, but for me, this was something that really made it real and relevant, spending time with people who were vulnerable in so many ways and who were so gracious in opening up their lives to me and trying to find ways that I could relate with them and support them and serve them. So as I say, it was really providential. I could have gone off on this whole other career path, but I didn't. And I spent many decades kind of doing that work, eventually working with people with physical impairments and intellectual impairments, children, adults, supporting people at home and at school and at work. So very much a blessing. And that actually brought me to study theology because I really wanted to, again, learn more about what our faith has to say about vulnerability and how we can treat one another as brothers and sisters.
Thank you. Valerie?
Yeah. Oh, that's beautiful. I love, just hearing you, I'm thinking, how Christ was calling you and meeting you and the poor in that circumstances. And I can relate to that. And another way God calls you is through your wife, right? And encounters you through your wife. And I understand that you collaborate closely with your wife, Jo Massarelli, and just wondering how her interests and skills complement yours.
Yeah, very much so. And yes, that was actually a part of the providence. So that organization that I worked for straight out of my undergraduate program, she has her own training project called the SRV Implementation Project, and she built this up herself, and it trains internationally. So she was actually, in a sense, her organization was housed within this other organization. And so as part of what happened was I was sent to some training that she was doing, and that's how we first met. And obviously it didn't stop there. So we eventually did marry, and I began working with her. And so working within her project. And so she was one of my first and best teachers of many of the ideas that I try to embody now. But more than that, of course, entered me into a whole other sacrament of the church. And it's been a true blessing. Introduced me to the Catholic Worker, which she was very involved with. So the Catholic Worker is started by Dorothy Day and Peter Morin, who provide hospitality to homeless people. And so I got very involved with that, thanks to her. And so, yes, I think, her real gifts I think our hospitality, her ability to welcome people and to make them feel at home. So we've had people live with us who were on the streets or had spent time in prison, who struggle with addictions or with different kinds of psychiatric conditions. So hospitality, right, making people feel welcome and at home and part of the family is one of her clearest gifts, I think. And it's something that I have learned from her and certainly, but she is still the best at that. I think another part of her gifts is around what you might call medical safeguarding. She spends a lot of time thinking about vulnerable people when they're in the healthcare system and helping primarily family, to think about how can they really safeguard, preserve, and honor the dignity of that person so that they get the best possible care and get treated with great dignity. As you know, as John Paul wrote about right in The Culture of Death, it's not an easy world for people with impairments in our medical systems today, either at infants or at the other end of the life spectrum or anywhere in between, particularly if you're someone who perhaps doesn't speak or doesn't communicate in ways that others understand or is isolated. And so this is really where her heart is trying to stand on the side of vulnerable people and defend their lives and teaching others how to do that as well.
Beautiful.
You're going to tell us about, it's a mouthful, social role valorization. But first, a trick question. If we hear the name wolf, what should we connect it with?
Right. Okay. Well, I'm thinking of Wolf Wolfensberger, who developed social valorization.
Who went to a small Catholic liberal arts school, Siena, and took the marvelous discipline of philosophy as his major.
Indeed. I thought that would brighten your day when you learned that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you can tell, even probably by the name social valorization, English is not his first language. So he was born in Germany, and actually was there as a child during the war and was sent away by his family so that he could survive the war. Eventually comes to the United States to study, and becomes one of the most influential figures in the 20th century thinkers in the field of, what was then called mental retardation, right? Services to people who were intellectually impaired in some way and physically as well. And he was very influenced by what was an idea that came out of the Scandinavian countries called normalization, was how do we offer people as typical a life as possible? And he took those ideas and really contextualized them and brought a lot of kind of theoretical underpinning to them. How do we actually do that? What does that look like? How do we help vulnerable people have access to the good things of life? The things that all of us take for granted, right? Not pie in the sky, not far out of reach, but things like home and family and friends, work, learning, worship, leisure. And his insight was that, we think about helping people have valued roles in their communities. Can people be neighbors, friends, employees, parishioners, travelers, customers? And it's through those valued roles that other people can see them as persons, right? Not see the impairment first, but see the person behind that. And so that term, social role valorization, in his language, was meant to say, how do we add value to people's social roles, right? Their roles in the community, their roles in the society. And this really has been the driving force behind really my whole approach to how I try to serve people. But in an odd way, again, providentially, also has influenced my theology. He was a lifelong Catholic. He has a number of theological writings as well. And he very much influenced, again, the way I approach theology too. But a mouthful indeed. People often just use SRV for short.
And there's a journal.
And there's a
SRV Journal.
Oh, the journal. Correct. Right. Yes. So.
And there's the editor of that journal.
And you're speaking with him currently.
Right? Yours unruly.
Yeah. So, writing and teaching, right? It's one of the ways to share the ideas. And so writing was always very important to him. Now, there had been a predecessor journal that was actually published in English and French. And the editor of that essentially stepped down from that position, and it seemed as if maybe that was going to be it for that journal. But I agreed, with some support from my wife Jo and her organization, that we would start it again with a slightly new name, because we didn't have the capacity to do the French translation. And so the SRV Journal. So publishing twice a year, and we tried to get people who are, working within services, right, and with family members, to write articles on that level that would be very understandable to others. So it's really a mix of maybe some more conceptual articles, but also some shorter practical articles about how these ideas can be applied in schools and homes and jobs. We have book reviews and so on. So came out twice a year, and it's been a very helpful way to again share the ideas beyond the workshop. We have a number of conferences that occur every 3 or 4 years, international conferences, and many of those papers will end up in the journal as well. So yeah, it's been a great gift, really, and has helped me to think about my own writing and encouraging others to write as well.
On social role valorization, there's a familiar link. I think it's a link. Never mind the poetry. My mother taught special education for many years, and I often heard her discussing strategies for mainstreaming. Now, you're probably familiar with that term, and I'm not sure that I had it right at the time, but it seems to me that the more mainstreamed a person with disabilities is, the more likely there is to be social role valorization. Does that connect?
Yes, it does. I mean, we might use a little bit different terminology, but I think conceptually, absolutely, right? So, when I was growing up, and maybe the experience of many people in previous generations as well, and frankly, still to some degree today, particularly outside of North America, the kind of main model, if people with impairments were offered any education, it was often segregated, right? It was separate. It was in either they didn't get it, or they were in separate rooms, they were in separate buildings. And that may have been done with the best of intentions. People weren't necessarily sure what's, first of all, people weren't sure that people with impairments could actually learn. So did school even make a sense, right? And it took the fighting of many parents to change that idea. And then they thought, well, they need specialized approaches, right, based on their impairment. So we need to do that separately. But as we've learned, right, separate is not always necessarily the best or equal, right? And so the idea eventually became, can we work more towards what many call inclusion, what SRV calls personal social integration and valued participation? Can we have people with impairments in the regular classrooms, in the cafeteria, in the gymnasium, learning and doing alongside others, right? This takes advantage of just the natural way that we learn, right? Through having natural environments, through being around others. Yes, it can be challenging, but again, that's a part of how we learn. So this kind of mainstreaming idea was, as much as possible, can we have people not learning separately, not eating lunch in a separate place or at a different time, not skipping the gymnasium, not doing all of the after school activities, but being right there with others. Sure, with additional supports as needed, but the more that we can do that, right? And this is not necessarily a yes or no or an all or nothing, right? The more that we can move towards that, the more that people will learn, will develop those roles of student, of friend, of athlete. Not only will that help them to learn and grow as a human being, right? Seems natural to us, but it will also, in the long run, change the attitudes and the values, I think, of the larger culture, right? When they are getting to see people with impairments as more like them than unlike them. Not getting fixated on the impairment, but seeing the human being that's there, right? And I think that's kind of a long-term benefit of those kind of approaches.
Probably maybe unexpected, but probably an implication of that would be getting rid of the faculty lunchroom.
Yeah. Well, you want to get us in there with the students? Should I be eating in the cafeteria?
For better or for worse.
Absolutely.
All right, Mario, take us forward, please.
Okay, I have a question regarding the connection that do you see between peacemaking, the church, and the Christian with the impairments?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that actually brings together my own, personal theological studies and interests, right? I'm very interested in this challenge, as the U.S. bishops called it, this challenge of peace and peacemaking that's laid before us, not only as individual disciples, but as a church. And I think if we look at the biblical understanding of peace, of shalom and irene, right, in the Old and New Testament, respectively, it's too simple to say it's the absence of violence, it's the absence of conflict or war. The biblical account seems to say that peace is more like human flourishing, right? It is having a good life and health and friends and family and being a part of the covenant and enjoying the goods of the earth, right? Having labor. So all of those things kind of come together when we think about what peace is, right? And that's a very rich understanding. And I think does have certainly relevance to situations of war and conflict. So I'm not putting that to the side. That's a part of it. But I think if we take that biblical understanding of peace, then we can see, okay, well, how the parish should be a natural home, right? The bishops say in the compendium that the parish is a natural place to kind of incarnate Catholic social teaching, right? That's where people should meet it and see it played out. So I think that to the degree that a parish can recognize and welcome fellow disciples with impairments and their families, I think that's really important. It's something I learned from Wolfensberger and their families. The more that the parish will be receiving those gifts of peace. And frankly, they're there, right? People with impairments are there in our midst, but I think we don't always necessarily recognize it. They may not always necessarily feel welcome in the parish, for good or bad. And so how can we first recognize that they are that they're part of us and bring them into it, right? In our liturgical celebrations, just like I said with school, not just during the Mass, but certainly during the Mass, but in other events, in Bible studies, in adoration, in celebrations in parishioners' homes, right? How are we building up that richness of peace within the parish? How are we, in fact, and the U.S. bishops, make this very clear, as well as the National Catholic Partnership for Disability, how we recognize that people with impairments can also be ministers, right? How are they offering ministry? They're not just receiving, but they are giving back, right? They are full disciples, right? Who should receive the sacraments. The church says that is the default position, right? That people should be offered the sacraments, right? For many years that wasn't true, but that's the case now, right? And that therefore they too can minister to us, right, in different ways. So how do we recognize those gifts? And so I think that sense of building up that peace within the parish, and of course it's not just with people with impairments, although that's our topic for today. So the more that we can build up that fraternity, that unity, I think that peace within the parish will then move its way out into families and neighborhoods and schools and workplaces, and can also change society again in the long run, right? Can spread that kingdom and that good news in a very embodied, incarnate way that people can see, right, and touch and hear and be a part of, right? So that's the beautiful vision, I think, and it's one we always, want to be. Again, it's not all or nothing. How do we keep working closer and closer to that? What would be a little bit better, right, as we move forward together?
Thank you. Valerie?
Well, that's inspiring. Wondering about shifting a bit in terms of the healthcare setting. Often physical and mechanical restraints are a part of healthcare. For one reason or another, for better or for worse. What are the current practices, in that area, and what are the proposed reforms that you would put out there?
Thank you. Maybe offer a little context of that. So in 1999 in Connecticut, where Holy Apostles is located, the Hartford Courant newspaper, put out a whole series called Deadly Restraint. And they had done a long series of studies of children and adults with physical and intellectual impairments and psychiatric disorders who were being restrained by their services. And I can talk about what that means in a minute, and were being injured or even outright dying as a result. And this caught my attention, from both as a Catholic, as a budding theologian, but as a human service worker. What was going on here, right? And these were things that were happening in my neighborhood, in my community, really without being aware of it. And so, what is it, right? So restraint means the use of some kind of force to limit a person's movement, whether that's physical by actually laying hands on a person, mechanical, using different kinds of straps, for example, or there are things, special purpose equipment called restraint chairs and restraint beds. Even things like concave mattresses in a nursing home, purposely designed to keep an elder who is not able to physically move not able to get out of bed on their own, or so-called chemical restraints, right? The injection usually of some kind of drug that will immediately either sedate or limit the person's movement. And I mostly was, concerned about how this was happening in human services, and right, nobody was talking about it, and nobody was seeing the consequences, as the Hartford Courant pointed out. It's used, and frankly, even since 1999, when this report came out, and later on a GAO government study came out about it as well. Unfortunately, it has spread, right? We've seen it now used in homeless shelters, in group residential programs, and frankly, in our special education programs, and even in schools. Not just with kids with impairments, but with typical children as well, particularly as you have schools that have security officers. And the injuries and deaths are still occurring. And so it's a very worrisome practice. It sparked a whole, frankly, economic move. You have many, many organizations now that will teach people how to do these things, right? And so you have an economic motivation behind it also, which makes it particularly difficult to kind of tease apart, right? It's been written into many policies now. At the same time, it's very hard to get hard data. Many of these organizations won't release how often are they doing this. But from what we can tell from first-person accounts and from family experiences, these are things that don't just happen once, but often happen multiple times to people who are vulnerable in receiving service. And despite their rhetoric, it's not always because someone was posing a danger to themselves or others. This is usually the message you hear. Well, they were going to hurt themselves or hurt somebody else, so we had no other option. The Hartford Courant and the GAO reports and many studies since then have shown that more often than not, it's the service trying to have some measure of control over the person's movements and activities, right? They're not following the rules, and therefore they're enforcing compliance, right? I'm not saying there aren't people who do cause danger to themselves, others. But that's not the majority, as far as we see. When you place somebody, many human service programs, you may be living together with a lot of other people you don't know. You may be served together in a day program with a lot of other people you don't know. It can be a very frightening and confusing experience. You may be having to follow rules that maybe don't make sense to you. And on top of that, if you do have an intellectual limitation or you have some kind of psychiatric disorder, it can be very overwhelming, right? And people can act in ways that I think would be a normative reaction, right? Why are you telling me what to do? Why do I have to eat at this time or go to bed at this time or not do what I want to do or not talk to this person? And sure, people can respond as we would all respond if that happened to us, right? By trying to assert our identity, our rights, our autonomy. And restraint is often used, unfortunately, as a response to that. And I don't blame service workers necessarily. If you're responsible for 8 people living together or 40 people in a day program, and there's 2 of you, right? It can be very difficult, and restraint might be seen as a way to kind of keep things calm and controlled. But again, at the same time, I think we have to very much worry about not only what is happening to the person, but what's happening in that relationship of service between the server and the served, right? Christianity says that this is an opportunity to meet Christ, right? That this is the hidden Christ when we can help somebody, right? Matthew 25, when we can help another person It's an opportunity to meet our Lord. But if we're put in a situation where we're told and trained and ordered actually that what we need to do is put our hands on them or put them into some mechanical restraints, I think that can have really debilitating effects on the relationship that should be in existence between the person helping and the person being helped, right? It can put this kind of perception that this other person is a menace somehow or is an obstacle that I need to deal with, and we may be asked to do things that we wouldn't normally do. And if you do that repeatedly, right, what's happening to that relationship there? And a lot of service workers will talk about this, right? That they don't like this idea. This is not why they got into the field. And so it's, as I say, not only is it an ongoing problem, but it seems to be seeping into other service fields. I think schools is the one that is kind of most disturbing to people when they hear about this, that children may be being restrained. I met a parent who found out almost by accident at a meeting with teachers that her daughter had been restrained, right? Many times in the school without her knowledge. Now, her daughter had some intellectual impairments, but as a parent, she wasn't told about this, right? And this had been going on all year. So what does that do to a child, right? What does that do to a teacher who's there to teach, who's being asked to do this? So it's a really complex situation, right? I don't think there's any simple answer to it. Frankly, I think some of the ideas the church can help. I think ideas like subsidiarity, getting things down small and local, can really help. Respecting the dignity of the other person, thinking about the common good, not being so kind of economically driven or policy driven, but think about who is this person? What do they really need? What would be best for them? To go back to your idea of mainstreaming, Jim, how can we get them into kind of more normative, typical activities, right? How do we not set up a situation where I'm responsible for many more people than I could possibly help, at one time? So there's a lot that could be done. But I think until we recognize the problem, it may just continue, unfortunately. And I would hope that, like the deinstitutionalization movement, which was, in the 50s and 60s, many parents really pushed to get away from these large institutions with hundreds of people living in them down to much smaller. I would think that one possibility would be for parents to really advocate, right, for these things to change as well. So, yeah, a lot to say, but I maybe you've got follow-up questions, but that's some initial thoughts.
I'm just curious if you have even a single, if you were to say, here's one thing that I think might be a practical step that we could take if we had the resourcing for it to help people navigate those tensions.
Yeah. Interesting, right? I think for a service worker to, if they're in a system like that, right, there's a few things you could do. You could try to develop a personal relationship with one of the people supported and really get to know that one person. And because often when you know them, you can start to figure out, right, what's the best way perhaps to communicate them? What are their strengths and weaknesses? What's their personality? And if you can develop a trusting relationship and a mutual relationship with them, you may be in a position for that one person, right, to do something a little bit different. That would be one idea. Another idea would be, right, to kind of step out of that system and look to cultivate a relationship freely given with a person who's in that situation. Can you meet somebody in a nursing home, for example, not as part of your job, but just to develop a relationship with them, right? So developing a personal relationship outside of those policies and structures that can give you a little bit more freedom. To go back to Wolfensberger, he developed this idea called citizen advocacy, where an individual in the community would be matched up with somebody who is vulnerable in some kind of service and develop a freely given relationship with them, right? Again, that can reduce some of those. Nobody can tell that person you have to follow our policies, right? You're a freely given agent there. So that's another idea. I would say advocating also. Much of what we learned in the Hartford Current and other studies was service workers telling others about this and talking about what was happening. I think getting information out there is another good strategy, right? Kind of for long-term change. It's just telling those stories, right? And talking about what you're seeing. And that can both inspire people and maybe get people back to the table to think about what would be a little better. That's a few ideas.
Yeah, thank you.
I could use, on a personal level, even more ideas. Here's what my wife and I struggle with every day. For 5 years now, my older brother has lived with us, and he has been diagnosed with dementia, and we've seen it worsen. He has, for the last year, been completely incontinent. And this takes us to the nittiest of the grittiest.
Mm-hmm.
How do you change a person? We're talking diapers here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
How do you change a person 4 or 5 times a day when characteristically you have to deal with real anger,
Mm-hmm.
The language of sailors, even though he was in the Air Force, and not to put too fine a point on it, sharp teeth.
Mm-hmm.
We often come away from a diaper changing session with lots of bruises.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in the past, I've been told, I don't know whether these stories are true, about the proverbial little old lady who lifts the car off of an injured son of hers with this incredible burst of strength.
Mm-hmm.
You have someone who really can't walk suddenly flailing his legs in every direction and grabbing and trying to bite you. Now, what we've had to do is use restraints. And how do the restraints work? They're thick gloves.
Mm-hmm.
Think of a hot pad and you're taking something off the stove. Even so, remarkable strength. And when you have a caregiver, and we do have a caregiver for 8 hours a day, when you have a caregiver and you have yourself and you have your wife, it's sometimes all we can do to get him changed. And this isn't, there was this occasion on which this is every day. And so it seems to us that we have to use the restraints. I wouldn't know how to give him basic personal care without the restraints. But as you point out, it can really change your response
Mm-hmm.
to even a loved one who you've known all your life. Now, the way that we can deal with this, and I'm sure many people do, and once again, it's a balancing thing. You can give a higher level of sedation, but if you do, there's a loss that comes with that. And it's tricky. It's not like a 1-a-day multiple vitamin pill.
Mm-hmm.
You maybe can count on 4 hours of the sedation working. And so when are you going to give it? And you try this schedule and then you try the other schedule. And then there's the whole question of describing this
Mm-hmm.
to your conveniently out-of-town relatives. But I'm sure you've heard all of this before, but it's a restraints question.
Yes,
Oh,
absolutely.
I'm sure you have 250 words or less. I know you have a way to resolve this, and you go ahead. You could go 260 words if you want.
Yes, well, thank you for that. And I think that there are in my experience, many families and friends, right, who are doing this kind of quietly, right? And outside, it sounds like in your home, right, outside of a human service structure, really, right? You're trying to do this, maybe with some paid help, but just many, heroic stories of families who are, doing this day by day. I met a family whose son actually would very much hurt himself, and they talked about, frankly, spending decades where he slept in the bed between them so that if he started to do this, they would wake up, right? And they didn't get a full night's sleep for decades, right? Just amazing kind of sacrificial service that so many families haven't engaged with, right? In an attempt to try to do what's best for the person. Now, I would distinguish this, right? I think there's a difference between something that an organization is doing, where you have someone who is an employee who doesn't know the person prior, who has no relationship with them, right? Who's been trained, oriented, paid to do something like the services trained, versus a family trying to figure out what are we going to do, right? And I certainly appreciate it. I mean, I was a human service worker with somebody who also required much physical care, including what you said, right? Getting him changed if he had, an accident, and helping him to eat and to move and to get dressed and to go to bed and to bathe. And he wasn't able to speak. So he would get quite angry at us sometimes if we, understandably, moved him too fast or not in the way he was used to, or, frankly, just dressing someone who's, a stranger, right, is a very stress-inducing, you imagine, for the person, right? And we really did have to think about how can we do this in a way that, is the best possible, right? I don't think there is one perfect answer, but what can we do that's the best possible? It sounds like you're really working in a relationship, right, with him. You're trying to offer the best that you can. You're coming up with some creative options. I'm sure you're praying about it as well. But it's absolutely not easy. I think this is why I think the church has really something to offer here, the Christian discipleship, right? Because I think that, what do I mean by that? Well, one is, right, we have this idea that Christ is with us when we try to serve another, right? This idea that we take up our cross, and even when it's difficult, that grace will be there to help us, right? Doesn't mean it ever goes away or it ever gets easier, but we have this belief that Christ is by our side, right? When we're trying to do something on behalf of another person, even if that causes us suffering in return, which it sounds like it is for you and your wife, right? So I think that's something that we have to offer. I think another thing too is, right, an insight of the way the church teaches about how we should support one another. And I think, frankly, this is more in the ideal than in practice. But we should have a community around us, right? It's very difficult to do in isolation and by yourself. And I think this is a place where parishes could be much more helpful and supportive, right? This, I think, was the model of the Catholic worker, was to try to get parishes to say, homelessness is a big problem, but what can we do, right? And if we band together as a parish, right, can we help a limited number of people, right? So I think trying to do this on your own, is very, very difficult. And so one question we as a church could face is, how could we support one another, right? Could there be people who could help out your family or other families in similar situations with spending time with a person, with meals, with prayer, with visiting, with respite or a break, right? A vacation. So no simple solution, no one solution. But I think there's a lot in our faith, a lot in Catholic social teaching, a lot in the scriptures about how as a community, if we could come together better. Knowing that, on this side of heaven, it won't be ideal, it won't be perfect, but we can get closer to it. And I think sharing, I said before, sharing your story and sharing these kind of stories is really helpful, right? Because I'm sure there's lots of people who don't know that that's what's going on for you. And I'm sure if I look around my neighborhood, maybe there's something similar happening there too that I'm not aware of, right? If I look around my parish, I bet there's other people who are struggling with that too and feel like they have to do it alone, right? So how do we do better at that as a church? I think is a really vital question for us, right? Are our churches providing what Acts talks about, right? That kind of mutual support and fraternity and fellowship that Francis and Benedict and John Paul really called us to embody.
We could have a little something in the bulletin about bed sores 101.
Yeah.
Let's see how many people sign up. Mario, it's time for us to go philosophical.
Okay.
Well, I'm not sure that we could go philosophical after this conversation. What you are saying is very moving. And I do have an experience in my home country, Paraguay, where there is a parish which is the only parish who was visited by Pope Francis when he visited Latin America. It's the only one. He went to see the parish, and the parish was built many years ago, and is run by a priest, very charismatic priest. Now is getting very old, but he was the founder of all these, where you have everything in one place. Let's put it this way. In other words, the parish was the synthesis of a small city, a model on the Jesuit mission in 1700. So you have there, of course, a house of worship. You have a school for kids. You have a hospital for people who has no money to go and they die there. You have volunteer working on that, physicians and all that. You have a little restaurant for people to get together on weekend. You have a little theater for kids to perform arts. You have everything. It's a small city. So when you go there, it's very interesting how educational the place is, because you see the kids playing during the recess in their classes, and then you see the people who are coming to mourn someone who just died, and they see all this event, the kids, and for them, death and life, play and mourning is one in the same part of Christian life. So it's so educational that when you are there, the only reaction that you have is go and try to work as a volunteer. And as a matter of fact, there was a young professor from Notre Dame who visited and went to volunteer because it was very moving. And so what is the claim, if you can will, that modernity destroy that unit in order to somehow be more efficient? So our parishes become part of modernity model. You have one people dedicated to this, another to this. Instead, the parish being a movement which is alive and generated a new life in Christ. So, the reason why Pope Francis visited is because he was so attracted to this model and still alive and survive financially with the contribution of people around the world, because the state in my home country is very reluctant to give money to those kind of things because all the debate about church state and all that. But it's very interesting. People who need care in the same way that you were describing, well, they receive the care really, which is unique. And so I'm just telling you, you can go, I think, the internet, and you can see, I don't know how good the website is, but you can see how they have built this place. And the catechism that this priest is following is Communion and Liberation of Father Giussani, which come from Italy. So the founder of that place is a missionary of that fraternity. So it's just a side comment. I don't know how to move from this to philosophy, I think. But one of the questions that anyone asks, particular students, is that if we begin with a notion or a definition of what a human person is, and we say, well, we have reason and free choice. how does this account mean? What is the meaning of that in a person who has severe disabilities?
Yeah, well, thank you. I will look up that example, by the way. I think that kind of thing can be very powerful, right? You hear about people in the U.S. looking at things like the so-called Benedict option and so on. I think that was some people trying to do that, or that town in Belgium, Giel, where for centuries they have supported people with psychiatric disorders in the village. But back to your point, I think it's a great question, right? So, what does it mean to say we're rational creatures, right, with intellect and will? And here's where, for me, one of the kind of clearest writers on this, I think, recently, a professor from Salve Regina in Rhode Island, Miguel Romero, it's a theologian, Thomist, and he has a brother who's quite physically and intellectually impaired, and he's written beautifully about this idea of, like, what is Thomas talking about when we talk about people having a rational nature and intellect and will? It says it's not necessarily discursive reason, right, to be able to make a logical argument, to write a research paper, right? But more, it's that the person has the capacity to know and love God, right? That's what it is for the human being, unlike any other part of creation, right? That we can know and love God, that we can contemplate the transcendentals, we can see the truth, the beauty, and the goodness in another person. And he says that's what is distinct, or one of the distinct things about a human person, and therefore even somebody with a very profound intellectual impairment, right, can still, on some level, know and love God, can still desire truth, beauty, and goodness, can recognize that in another. And that has been my experience, right? I spent time with people who, right, could not even talk, couldn't communicate, could not do arithmetic, couldn't learn certain skills like cooking or dressing themselves and so on. Right, but spending time with them, they can just be someone who can be very peaceful, even in the midst of, as you've described, Jim, probably a lot of anxiety and stress about life and what's happening to me now, and not understanding it, and yet can have an appreciation for peace, can have an appreciation for beauty. I think that is apparent to others in some way. And I think, frankly, it's hard to describe this, right? Because I think it happens on a spiritual level, right? Where you can see someone in let's say, a nursing home, or in some kind of program, or a homeless person who, despite everything that's going on around them, right, seems to show some dignity, some appreciation for love and truth and beauty and goodness. And I think that's an indication, right, that Romero was correct, right? It's not that we can, build rocket ships or write, sonatas and symphonies and write a 3-volume text on something, but that we can know and love God, right? We can appreciate that He loves us, and we can appreciate the gifts of truth, beauty, and goodness. And if that's the case, then we can, no matter how profoundly impaired the person is, right, particularly intellectually, that's something we share with that person, right? That's a bond there. That's a fraternity. That can change the way that, frankly, we look at ourselves and our relationship with God. Now, I'm not saying that every person, here's the other side, right? Sometimes people treat people with impairments as if somehow they're angels, right? And there's a philosophical problem, right? They're not. They're human beings, right? They are, created, fallen, and redeemed. Okay. So they have the capacity for goodness. They have the capacity for sin. This is why the church says the default is for them to receive the sacrament, so they can be saved from original sin, so they can have the grace of confirmation, right? They can receive the Eucharist. So we don't want to go too far, right, and treat them as if they were somehow angelic beings, not human beings. But nor do we want to say, well, because they can't speak or add or drive or cook or dress themselves, that they are perhaps fundamentally different from us in who we are as fellow human beings. So I don't know if that gets a little bit to your point, but yeah, I would really encourage people to look at Romero's writings, Miguel Romero's writings, and others along that ilk, for thinking about this question, right?
Just a side comment, and I think one of the I don't know, a debate or claim made by some personalist in the 20th century, particularly the Latin tradition. They somehow, I'm not saying dismiss, but move beyond the definition of what a person is, and what a human being is, or a rational animal. Rather, what is a person is the being which is capable of love. So it's a unique type of being, which is nothing in nature which is similar to that. And so from that on, they say, well, we need to start building a set of relationship and affection, et cetera, from this. It's just a side comment about that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Valerie, we're unfortunately getting close to the end of the hour. Do you want to pursue any of these questions or lead us to something new before we close?
Well, I think based on the exchange that just happened, I'm curious, one of our questions was regarding defining versus discerning of persons and the work of P.M. Matthews, the theologian. And I just wonder if you wouldn't just say a little bit about that.
Excellent.
Yeah, good. So I'm not entirely familiar with that. I know that she has, I think, a book that she's written about that idea. So I haven't read it. But I will just maybe make a stab at the general ideas. I think, if we as you were just saying, Mario, how do we define what a human being is, a person, right? One of the things that Wolfensberger warned about was a fixation on impairment, saying all you see is the impairment. Is it cerebral palsy? Is it Down syndrome? Is it, is it schizophrenia? That is not helpful, right? So I don't know if this is what P.M. Matthews means by that, but I would say that's a danger. If we define a person simply by the kind of material or the visible or by the impairment or the limitation, we're going down a wrong road. And I think what the church says is that we have to know that this is a human being created by God in love, right, with a soul that has a purpose, that is someone that we can be in fraternal relationship with, that should be destined for heaven, right? So how do we discern that when it's difficult, when perhaps the person doesn't speak to us, or as Jim said, maybe tries to hurt us, right? Or doesn't seem to pay attention to the world around them. And yet we believe that there is a human being there, right, that we can relate to, that God loves and is relating to. So how do we discern that? And again, it's not always easy, right? It can be very difficult. You go into a jail, a homeless shelter, a nursing home, a group residence, a psychiatric hospital. I can remember as a person in high school, part of our school, we had a school trip where they took us to a psychiatric hospital. Our town happened to have one where my high school was. And frankly, we weren't prepared. It was, in hindsight, an awful thing to do because we had no idea and we just walked away scared, right? Because all we saw was people who probably had been there for decades, had been, probably overly drugged and medicated, who nobody spoke to, who were very friendless and isolated, and were scary to us, right? So how do we help young people? How do we help, parishes to discern who is this person, right? That I share the gift of creation with, and if they're a fellow Catholic, that I share the gift of baptism with, right? How am I getting to know that person, right? And in a mutual relationship, it's not one way, right? So again, I'm not sure I answered because I don't know P.M. Matthews as well, but hopefully that was helpful, and looks like Mario has
just a brief story that can perhaps illuminate a little bit. There is a story about a kid, very small kid. He was 14 years old, walking on the street and carrying out on his shoulder another kid, but very big, very heavy, and he was barely walking on the street, carrying this other kid, which is bigger than he was. And so somebody saw him carry on this kid, and said, "Hey, don't you see that what you are carrying is very heavy for you?" But the kid answered, "Is my brother."
Mm.
And I just want to throw out there, is part of the equation in discerning is just enjoying. God didn't make us because he needed us or for some utilitarian purpose. He made us so that we could enjoy his Trinitarian life of true love. So when we are in situations where you're under the very crushing weight of care for somebody who's very difficult to care for and be in relationship with, it seems to me that part of the way out of the burden is to enjoy, to find the ways that we can to enjoy that relationship, and discerning, not just enjoying, but even just resting in the truth of calling to mind and practicing our faith and our hope and our charity, and choosing to rest in a space of maybe even just doing nothing and sitting in those truths, those eternal transcendent truths, finding a way to rest with someone and helping them to rest in us, in our presence, even just for brief periods of time, if we can't enjoy, but also just seeking ways to enjoy. This is something that just as a mother with 6 kids that are very needy, I have to remember to give myself space to balance the hards, with joys and with rest in relationship. So I know we're kind of past time, but I felt called to mention that. So.
Well, we are going to have something called the Theology of the Nap. That might be something to pursue. Thanks very much for that, Valerie. We have to delight. One or two last threads on Pia Matthews. That's an extraordinary book. She looks at all the patristic Christological debates and points out how again and again they involve the relation of person, nature, and human being. And there's a wide range of positions, some of which are hauntingly familiar in terms of contemporary debates about person, nature, and the human being. And one of her main themes, which the title captures, is we can't have a prearranged set of criteria that we use to identify who is a person and who is not a person, when and why. We have to discern the person. The person transcends any given structure, but certain structures are necessary for there to be a person. So that connection, well worked out with Christological debates, is just fascinating. Another point to conclude with on the philosophical front is Thomas notes that the soul is everywhere, wholly present in the body. I think a lot of us are somehow thinking that, well, if the brain is badly damaged, doesn't that somehow affect the soul itself? Only insofar as it affects the soul's manifestation of itself. The soul itself is wholly present everywhere within the human being. Well, we close now as we always do with the gospel for the day, and this gospel is from John. Jesus said to his disciples, "I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine grower. He takes away every branch in me that does not bear fruit, and every one that does, he prunes so that it bears more fruit. You are already pruned because of the word that I spoke to you. remain in me as I remain in you. Just as a branch cannot bear fruit on its own unless it remains on the vine, so neither can you unless you remain in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. Whoever remains in me and I in him will bear much fruit, because without me you can do nothing. Anyone who does not remain in me will be thrown out like a branch and wither. People will gather them and throw them into a fire, and they will be burned. If you remain in me and my words remain in you, ask for whatever you want, and it will be done for you. By this is my Father glorified, that you bear much fruit and become my disciples. Come, Lord Jesus, come. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
There's a last anecdote. When things go wrong, we might think of Stanley Wisniewski, lifelong Catholic worker, saying that at the worker they knew each other in the breaking of the bread and the cracking of the heads. All right.
Yeah.
Godspeed.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, all of you, for your
Mark.
questions and your witness.
Godspeed.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.